So chapter 15 and 16, neural integration, I'm going to handle in one PowerPoint as a unit. Some of this will be review material because we're going to start with sensory pathways and somatic nervous system. Sensory input and the somatic nervous system, the control of our skeletal muscles. Now, this is going to involve a pathway that begins with a sensory receptor. So a pain, a temperature, a touch receptor here in the fingertip. It's going to be followed by an afferent tract that's bringing that message to a processing area. Now that may be in the spine. If it's a reflex, it may be in the brain. We're going to deliver that information to all of the parts of the nervous system that need to be aware of that, let's say, burning sensation. After it arrives, there's going to be information processing with inputs from all over the brain, involving everything from memory and experience to body memory and current conditions. And a response is going to be generated and sent out through motor tracts, and those are going to involve from the information processing source, motor tracts out to motor neurons, which are going to go through the efferent system to the peripheral effectors. And again, those are either muscles, glands, or fat. That's all we can actually affect. The general senses, as we know them, are distributed throughout the skin and basically inform our body of its immediate environment, those things that are directly related to the body and the body surface itself. So we saw this as a function of the skin and the integumentary system. We'll just briefly review that, but basically pain, touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception. Proprioception is kind of the position from stretch receptors in the joints and in the muscles. Those are the general senses. Now, in addition, there are nerve tracts with very elaborate nerve endings that are there to interpret some source of energy coming from the environment. And those are called our special senses. Those are going to be covered in chapter 17 later. So these include sight, sound, taste, smell. As taste is actually pretty immediate, and it has to be the surface of the tongue to get taste, but they're still actually dealing with a kind of a distance interpretation of our surroundings. Always there's going to be two levels to this kind of interpretation. There's the nerve signal that moves from the receptor to a tract, or from the information processing through a tract. That's the sensation. But then there's the perception. Once it gets to its endpoint, and we are either aware of a sensation or we are producing a motor response, that's the perception. That's an interpretation of the sensation. The signals from the retinal surface of the eye are very different than what we perceive as our sense of sight. So chapter 15 will show us the left side of this diagram, with this being the primary loop: sensory receptors to pathways to processing centers in the brain, over to conscious and subconscious motor centers, back down through motor pathways to skeletal muscles. Now, I want you, before we do this closed loop, it'll be pretty quick. Notice the connections here. So the sensory processing centers of the brain are also providing contact of that sensory information to higher order functions, things like memory, learning, intelligence, those things. We're going to connect these motor pathways not just through conscious response, but also through adjustment of organ systems, autonomic systems, and finally, the visceral effectors, the smooth muscle, the heart muscle, and the glands that and the fat that can respond to nerve signals. Receptors. We look at the nerve endings, specialized as clusters or elaborations of the membrane. They're usually connected by white matter, label lines, in a continuous pathway up to the cortex of the brain. They may be active always or inactive always and activate only when stimulated. So there are tonic and phasic receptors. Constant stimulation, though, of them produces adaptation. And by this, and we kind of notice this, a noise makes us jump, but if it continues, we basically tune it out. We notice a pressure, but once we identify it as harmless, we basically ignore it. Maybe it's an air draft that's come in through an open window. When we get pain, notice that the first pain is generally pretty intense, but then although it keeps feeling pain, the actual intensity of the pain subsides as you address the cause of the pain and the injury. Most of these receptors are logically named, so thermo, mechano, chemo, those are all receptors. A thermoreceptor would have to do with heat. The new one may be this prefix nocio. A nocioreceptor is a pain receptor. This view of the epidermis with its, of the integument with its epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis provide us our first exposure to these branching nerve networks and the receptive fields that they produce. Now, noticeably, they go up to the very top of the dermis, and so they are sensitive if they are shallow. They are less sensitive if they are deep. They are sensitive if they are naked nerve endings, like you see here. They are less sensitive if they are covered with layers of membrane. So we did see a variety of these kinds of free nerve endings. You see those here. And corpuscles. So here the Merkel cells and tactile disc. This is fine touch, very sensitive. Here are Ruffini corpuscles, good for vibration. Here are lamellar corpuscles, deep pressure because of the wrapping of the nerve endings in many, many layers, kind of like an onion. Tactile corpuscles, because it's shallow, relatively sensitive, but not quite as sensitive as these free nerve endings. When we talk about the tracts that conduct the signals from the receptors, we find that they come in by labeled lines, principally white matter, and they're going to enter through the dorsal root where the sensory information comes in. Now, at this point, there may be some reflex processing, as we saw here in the spine, but it is also likely that it will be transferred to one of these ascending or afferent pathways shown in color. The posterior column shown in blue, the spinocerebellar tracts shown in yellow, obviously connecting the spinal cord to the cerebellum, and the spinothalamic tracts shown in green. These are white column associations that are in the left and right side in symmetrical arrangement. They are for the fast transmission of sensory information up to the brain. Now, when we look at the actual pathway of this tract, we get this kind of a diagram. So the spinothalamic is going to go from a spinal nerve, from a receptor through a spinal nerve into the spinal cord and then up one of these tracts. The spinothalamic tract is divided into anterior pair of white matter strands and a lateral pair of white matter strands, because these two actually conduct different kinds of messages. Crude touch and pressure from the right side of the body is shown entering the right side of the spinal column, and look at this, crossing over to the anterior spinothalamic tract on the left side, ascending up through that. So they kind of cut us away at the midbrain and pick us up because this is just basically relay centers through the pons and midbrain to the diencephalon. On the right side, it is received at a particular location because this touch came from a specific location. And the direction and the position of the arrow shows you where it came from. It's giving you crude touch and pressure information from the right hand. Now, drawn around here is this kind of strange arc of body parts, and what this is meant to be, it's called a homunculus, a representation of a human body, and the size of the body part tells you how sensitive it is. So you'll notice something, that our sensory acuity in our feet, legs, and trunk are relatively limited. This amount of brain cortex right here in the corner only, takes care of all of our crude touch and pressure sensations for the entire body. But you'll notice the neck looks a little big. The upper arm doesn't look that big compared to the body, but the forearm is very extended and the hand is gigantic, with disproportionate size assigned to the index finger and the thumb. That tells you where most of our sensory receptors are, because more cortex area means more sensory receptors. When you look at the face actually covers more, as much distance as the trunk and thigh, because there are many nerve endings in the face, not so many in the forehead. See how small that is? But the eyes are bigger, the nose is getting larger, but the lips, cheek, and mouth are especially sensitive. We see your sensitivity at the nerve endings in the teeth and in the tongue. Now, pain and temperature sensations, different kinds of sensations from different receptors in the skin, on the right side of the body are entering here, crossing over and going to the lateral tract. So they ascend through a completely different tract, but again are delivering information that's coming from the hand or fingers. Now, one of the things that occurs when you bundle these sensations together is a phenomenon called referred pain. When you put them together, an electrical impulse goes charging through one of the nerve packets. It produces a magnetic field that runs along the outside of it, and under normal nerve stimulation, it will not activate adjacent nerves. But under the stimulation of an intense pain, it produces a magnetic field which can stimulate an adjacent nerve from the outside. That produces the perception, not the actual sensation, but the perception of pain. And here's one that is illustrated well by our viewing of movies and TV and videos. When actors simulate a heart attack, you know how they typically hunch over their left side and they report a shooting pain in their arm on the left side? There's nothing actually being damaged out here. The message from the heart is so intense, it goes right in that spinal, through these tracts of pain sensation, and activate the adjacent white matter and fire it, producing the perception of a pain here on the upper left quadrant, shooting down the left arm. So other liver and gallbladder are sort of, you will get discomfort in that right abdominal region, but here you will also often get referred pain up around the right shoulder. The organs shown, stomach, small intestine, appendix, and colon, are sort of appropriately located. The ureters are spread out, arcing around the body, sort of like following the track of a spinal nerve as it comes, arcs around, and descends. If there is a pain in the ureter, such as a kidney stone is moving through it, it will produce this kind of converging pain down through the pelvic and inguinal regions. Now, the descending tracts, so the sensory tracts, which I've just given you a few examples of, go up to the brain, are processed. Information processing is going to send those messages back down the spinal column through so-called motor tracts. These are the efferent or descending tracts. Responses and commands are coming out of the brain that are going to effectors. Now, this is a little more difficult to visualize. So, for example, you might have a pain in your hand, but the way you're going to respond to that is to back up. So the muscles are not in the hand or in the arm, they're in the legs and feet. So the responses might be to a different part of the body, but you'll notice that the sensory tracts that we just talked about, 1, 2, and 3 are now colorless. And these paired tracts, 6 in number, are the motor tracts in the white matter. The corticospinal tracts are the lateral and the anterior corticospinal regions. You'll notice rubrospinal, vestibular, reticulospinal are the other names for these paired tracts that reflect the left and right bilateral organization of the body. Now, you know they're going to be coming from above, so they're going to be arriving from where you are down to this tract, and it's going to communicate information out to this gray matter, and if it is appropriate that an effector is at the end of this motor, this ventral root, then it will send messages out the ventral root to the effector. So to give you an example, we're going to actually draw this in more completely, because although the sensory information maps to the brain cortex, so that if it comes from the rib area on the right side, it's going to go to a specific place through the sensory tract. The response to that may involve an effector anywhere in the body. So information processing is going to feed that information to the appropriate area. Let's say what you're going to do in response to that rib stimulation is just to yell out, "Oh no." So it's going to come over here to this control. That control is going to come through a motor tract descending. Now, we're still in the cortex here, and here we've entered the brain stem. Now, a number of different departure points might exist. It may be connected to a cranial nerve, which is going to affect speech centers. The hypoglossal, control of the muscles of the tongue, are going to be involved. Control of the larynx and the regulation of the sound we make. If we're departing in for an activity by an effector in the head and neck region. If we're not, we're basically going further. We're going to descend into, basically through to the medulla oblongata, where there is a connection. This is called the decussation of pyramids. And often we see crossover to the other side, since the crossover of sensory produces the processing on the opposite side. Often we're going to cross over the response back to the original side. We see that descending to the appropriate level. Now, from this corticospinal pathway shown here, we're going to communicate that information at the proper level of the spinal cord to the motor horn, the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord, and send a message out through these motor tracts to the skeletal muscles, which are the proper effectors. Now, we're focusing on skeletal muscles because we were talking about in chapter 15 the somatic response specifically. The response to a sensory input may be different. That would involve invoking a different pathway and the autonomic nervous system. If we're talking about doing something like regulating the heartbeat, autonomic response, or a whole body response like sympathetic stimulation. Chapter 16, the neural integration 2, focuses on this right side of that original diagram, the autonomic nervous system, and also the real discussion points of when we talk about the brain and spinal cord. What we call higher order function, those things that we notice on a whole organism level. The ability to coordinate the body, the ability to learn easily, a good memory, personality, our sense of identity and the continuity of that. We don't have to relearn who we are every day. We know because we're constantly reminded of it. So that's what we're going to cover in neural integration 2. We're going to see that the motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system are going to form synapses outside the spinal cord on what we call ganglia. A ganglion is a cluster of nervous tissue, neuronal tissue, that includes gray matter and is outside the central nervous system, outside the brain and spinal cord. The messages from those ganglia are going to send the motor signals out to the effectors. So ganglion, gray matter outside the central nervous system. The integrating area, the hypothalamus, that kind of connecting area between all this neural activity we've talked about in the brain and the activity of the endocrine system, which is often involved in autonomic function. We will distinguish between the neurons that connect the spine to the ganglion, where information processing in gray matter is occurring, and the neurons that then continue on from the ganglia out to the effector. Let's take a look at the anatomy. So we're going to include part of this from chapter 15, but mainly as it affects conscious and subconscious motor centers in the brain and the information processing, the generation of the signal, and the initial entry into the motor pathways. But you can notice that the signals that are being kind of diverted off include those that include messages to the autonomic nervous system and their effectors, and those that include the higher order functions. Sensory information and its flow, its period. We recognize similarities. So the idea of sunrise and sunset, light during the day, dark during the night, something we automatically recognize from our experience. That's part of our memory. And it's part of our intelligence when we're deciding what to do today. So let's make a bit of an anatomical distinction. Here's what we just covered, this somatic nervous system, where motor centers, and notice how those, the important synapses here, the important cell bodies, are in this precentral gyrus, what we call the primary motor cortex. From there, depending on their position on the homunculus, they send messages out. Now, from here, we're in the face region, so that comes down to a cranial nerve, and basically then goes out to a muscle of the head or neck. The somatic system would send a message to the peripheral nervous system by basically making this connection extend down here into the spinal cord to the appropriate level, and then connection to a skeletal muscle of that region, whether it's the arm or the leg, wherever. So this is the somatic system. Notice how it's there is a synapse involved in the gray matter of the cranial nerve, the brainstem or the spinal cord, but then there's a continuous tract, the lower motor neurons going out to the effector. Pretty simple. Here's how the chapter 16, the autonomic nervous system, differs. First of all, we're going to organize this information through motor nuclei in the hypothalamus region. And then we're going to take two tracts here, but we're going to show descent inside the brain case. So this would be a cranial nerve region. And down here, we're taking it clear down into the spinal cord. And what we see is from that synapse, we go out to a ganglion. This is an autonomic ganglion outside the brain and spinal cord, where we have a second synapse. So this red is from the head and neck region into an autonomic ganglion that is in the neck. This is the preganglionic neuron. After the synapse in the gray matter of the ganglion, we go out to effectors, either smooth muscle or glands or cardiac muscle or fat. If we take that message further down, we would be entering what would be a intervertebral junction somewhere down in the vertebral column, and a preganglionic neuron attached to a ganglion where gray matter synapses will divert the signal to an effector in the periphery. So it's the presence of these ganglia and the hard wiring difference that we use to recognize the somatic on the left, the autonomic system on the right. So let's take a look at the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is a whole body organization that's aimed at maximum muscular exertion and survival. We call it fight or flight, when you're going to be using your strength, your speed, your endurance in an ultimate effort to preserve your life. Now, we notice something special about this division of the autonomic nervous system. First of all, its connections. It starts at the T1. It ends at the L2. The ganglionic neurons take a kind of three-way course, and I don't like this trident arrow here, because it turns out the majority of the connections are here to the sympathetic chain ganglia, which are paired. At that level, there's one on the right and one on the left. A few selected preganglionic neurons come through a chain ganglion and then go to a collateral ganglia before generating messages out to the effectors. And one track only goes from its connection through the sympathetic, through a collateral, to the adrenal medulla, which is a gland on top of the kidneys. So these three destinations all actually run parallel to one another. It's just that they depart at different places. If you leave the sympathetic chain ganglia, you go to the visceral effectors that are in the thorax, the head, the body wall, and the limbs. If you run down through the sympathetic to the collateral, you go to the visceral effectors at the abdominopelvic cavity. So as you can imagine, lots of digestive and regulation here and other organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. If you run all the way to the adrenal medulla, notice how the color changes. And what does that mean? Hormones are released. Sympathetic stimulation causes the hypothalamus to stimulate the pituitary gland, and an adrenal corticotrophic hormone. Adrenomedullary hormone is released that stimulates organs and systems throughout the body that have the right chemoreceptors. So, sympathetic division of autonomic, fight or flight, simultaneous activation of many organ systems. And I'm telling you, those systems start ramping up to maximum performance in a matter of seconds. There was a day I was in Rocky Mountain National Park, hiking above the timberline alone, where there's a lot of brush, but the brush grows, chest to shoulder high. A bear that's feeding in the berries in that underbrush could be completely concealed as you walk up on it, and you don't know until they stand up. Well, that didn't happen to me. But I was thinking about it as I was walking up this trail. I looked across the valley to the far slope and saw a grizzly bear, a wild grizzly bear. And he was probably 3 miles away, and it was probably 4,000 feet down and 4,000 feet back up. The wind was in my face, so I didn't have any idea that that bear would ever see me. But as I stood and watched it, my heart started pounding against my sternum. I could feel it. I started breathing faster, and that was activating my sympathetic response. Connections T1 to L2, the ventral route to the myelinated white ramus into a nearby chain ganglion. Now, here's what it looks like. Though the departure points here, these elements in the autonomic nervous system are only connected T1 through L2. But you'll notice from a typical connection, like let's take this connection, you go out to a nearby chain ganglion. It's called a chain ganglion because each one of the connections has its own ganglion. Above the T1, there are so-called cervical ganglia that don't connect in at this level, but basically connect back down through this pathway to T1 and T2 and so forth. Also down below, the L2 has an extension of chain ganglia that run all the way down to the coccygeal ganglion, the CO1. These are fused together down here, but they still represent an autonomic and sympathetic pathway. Now, both of these drawings are actually present on both sides, but what's shown over here is the connection of the sympathetic autonomic elements of motor command to the general senses. So what might we do with a signal to the left side? Notice that the postganglionic neurons, you can see that it's going to be long. It's going to connect to oil glands, erector muscles and fat in the skin. If there are sphincters controlling blood flow, by that I mean, is the blood flow deep, conserving heat, or is the blood allowed to flow right up here to the surface capillaries, where heat loss would be maximized? If you think about using your heart, lungs, and muscles to maximum amount, one of the things you know is going to happen is you're going to get hot. So thermoregulation, that would occur through the connections on the left side. On the right side, you see the connections to the named organs. So up here from the cervical region, we're going to connect to the eye and the salivary glands. We're going to connect through sympathetic nerves in the thorax to the heart, to the lungs. Now, going down, the eye is actually going to receive more blood and become more acute in its visual perception. You need to be able to see well to run fast and to fight hard. Do you need more saliva? Are you going to be involved in digestion? No. So you're probably going to dial down the saliva glands. You're going to dial up the heart, dial up the lungs, and very quickly. Down here below, we are seeing connections on the second level. Now here, through any one of these chain ganglia, we have connections to this, the celiac ganglion, and there are three: celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. These are the so-called collateral ganglia. They occur inside the abdominal cavity. They are single and not paired, but they provide the opportunity for post-ganglionic neurons to leave and go to the major organs of the abdomen and pelvis. Now, I'm going to ignore this one red track. That's the third pathway. You'll notice these secondary, these collateral ganglia, are going over and synapsing on things like liver, stomach, spleen, and pancreas, large and small intestines and rectum. They are synapsing on kidney and on the reproductive organs and urinary tracts. So here's the idea. You're fighting for your life. Are you going to be involved with digestion? No. Take blood away from there. Put it in the muscles. Are you going to be defined by basically how much urine you make? Nope. How about reproductive attraction? Not the time for it. So you're going to dial down these organs while you're dialing up these. And also delivering massive amounts of blood to the skeletal muscles. Now, we call sympathetic fight or flight. Maximum physical output. Maximal exertion. Another division is organized around a number of recurring tasks where we're autonomically regulating the regular function of our organs. This one, parasympathetic, is called rest and digest, and it's easy to understand how it's involved in digestion, because what happens when you, like me, it's been a long time since lunch. The next time I put food in, I'm going to switch my body over to digestion, meaning I'm going to flood the walls of my small intestines with blood in order to pick up the nutrients. At the same time, if I'm not called upon in an emergency, I'm going to take blood from the muscles. I'm going to feel a little drowsy. Parasympathetic stimulation is called rest and digest. It's going to conserve energy and lower our metabolic rate because our body is busy doing something. In this case, the primary activity that we're illustrating is digestion. It's going to be connected through 4 specific cranial nerves: 3, 7, 9, and 10. And down at the other end of the spine, the sacral nerves S2, 3, and 4. Now, parasympathetic is kind of odd because the sympathetic, the preganglionic neuron, is going into a collateral ganglion that's right nearby. And the postganglionic neuron is usually long, depending on the distance to the target. In the parasympathetic, there is no chain ganglion. So the preganglionic neurons vary in length, but typically go all the way to a ganglion that's at or near the organ. That means that the postganglionic neuron is often short. So that anatomical difference is a general guide. Here's the wiring of parasympathetic innervation. You'll notice the connection on the cranial nerve span above and on the sacral nerve span below, but you'll kind of notice a free interchange. The heart is way up here in the thoracic cavity, but elements from the sacral nerves, in fact, may be able to reach it. In general, it's a region by region distribution. And what is it doing? You've eaten a meal, you're now full of food, and your body's working on digestion. Generally, a few tears, and your eyes get a little blurry as you get drowsy. Your salivary glands are activated by eating a meal. Your heart can handle the blood circulation as long as you don't call on the skeletal muscles. And so you relax. Your heart rate is steady and your breathing rate is steady. Both would be described as at rest in an after meal relaxation mode. But all of these organs are being called upon for additional activity. You're going to tell the liver, make more bile, and the gallbladder to squirt bile as food goes by. The stomach, the small intestines, the large intestine are all going to be stimulated to muscular activity under local control. As the food begins to arrive, the muscles in that part begin to contract, propelling it along and mixing it with glandular secretions. As the food moves through, let's say you eat for 30 minutes and the food is moving through, there comes a time when you're done and the last of the food moves through. Then the signals from the previous area shut down, from the current area where the food is, shut down the previous area. So all along here you're getting activity. Kidneys. If you're eating a lot of protein, and amino acids are being used for energy, you're deaminating and making high levels of ammonia, which means high levels of urea, and you're going to kick up your kidney activity. The penis and the scrotum, due to their proximity, they have some involved in the urogenital tract, more united in males than in females. But here is the anatomy. Notice how it's different. Notice how the preganglionic neuron can be very long. Now, I want to point out that actually these organs are sitting right on top of the vertebral column. So basically, moving from the sacral region up to a position where you could innervate the stomach would be a sort of a halfway deal. Or from the vagus nerve, which is penetrating down from above, would be a shorter, a somewhat midway deal. Now, once you, though, have the ganglion with its gray matter is located right next to the organ, you notice how short those postganglionic fibers are, those that are shown in black. So here's a general comparison showing the length of the preganglionic fiber being different and the postganglionic fiber in general being different. There's a couple of other differences. So, for example, the black arrows are acetylcholine, and parasympathetic responds completely to acetylcholine receptors in the synapse. And over here, sympathetic is largely acetylcholine, but there are connections that depend on the hormones norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal gland. And so they act as neurotransmitters as they stimulate increased activity and control of the circulatory system or other target organs. These nerves twine and join and split into braids. They're called plexuses that occupy kind of a central band around the spinal region and the aortic region. You can see their position of autonomic plexuses. So the cardiac plexus, once you get that cardiac hookup to sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, It forms a network of nerves around the heart. The pulmonary plexus, the lungs, the esophageal plexus for the esophagus, and so on down through this ventral cavity. This introduces a new kind of reflex. We've seen spinal reflex and we've seen cranial reflex so far. But this is a different kind of reflex that actually supports a thing called local control. So you have a receptor in one part of an organ, let's say the small intestines right next to the stomach, and it basically connects to a ganglion that is outside and is able to send a sensory message that stimulates a motor response from the stomach to the intestine without ever going through the central nervous system. This is called a short reflex, when you use the gray matter in the ganglion as your information processing center instead of the gray matter in the spinal cord or in the brain. We will look at that connection a lot because it turns out next semester we've got the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the respiratory system. I could go on and on, which all show outside influences from conditions and from the central nervous system and endocrine system. But in general, the everyday operation is regulated within the organs of the organ system. So we do have this wonderful comparative chart showing you the flow. Here's sensory information coming in through pathways. Peripheral nervous system is yellow, central nervous system is purple, and if it enters over, then we have somatic reflexes from the gray matter of the spinal cord coming over here to the somatic nervous system and the skeletal muscles. If it reaches the relay processing centers in the brain, then it gets up here into higher order function. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, the cerebral cortex, all communicating with one another. So this is not just current conditions and the emergency of the moment, the activity of the moment. This is your memory. This is recognizing patterns and applying them to your decision making. The long reflex would go over here through the spinal cord to an autonomic regulator, down through the autonomic nervous system to the visceral effectors on the autonomic side. Up here, if we go all the way up, so we send this sensory signal. These are the visceral signals going to the hypothalamus. Here are the somatic signals going to the thalamus and cortex, processing that as a series of commands for skeletal muscle and then descending down from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system to the skeletal muscles that eventually will produce the response. Now, this is a topic, higher order brain function. We're going to get away from anatomy somewhat and really talk about the kind of mysterious way that these different brain regions act together to produce the daily patterns of our life and to regulate them. This is a wonderful place to stop this lecture. So I'm going to end chapter 15:16 A right here, and I will continue later.